All right. Well, here we are on season 4. Today is recording January 6th, 2019. And we just had a fantastic pre-show. Back the three of us together, Faisal Khan, Brian Roemmele, Mike Townsend here, bringing you Around the Coin back and in full speed. We have so much planned for 2019. Season 4 is going to be better than ever. We have a lot of new stuff. And yeah, I'm just really excited to get back and chat with you guys and get this going again. Faisal, I was just so impressed with the pre-show and the thought you have put into the show and where you want to take it. Do you want to give us a quick, give the folks listening quick description, quick intro about what you've been up to first since we've last chatted, last had the show, and where things are going for you and the show.
Hey, so thank you, and great to be back on air. I moved permanently to Istanbul. That's where I'm based now. Family is here, living here, working here, traveling a lot. So getting more serious about the show. We do this in our part-time, but I think we have to commit more to it. And in this coming year, we plan to take it from the template or format that it is currently into something much more beyond the show. Hopefully, somewhere down the line, this show becomes a show in a series of shows. We will have more guests. We will have more intelligent discussions. I think we've all universally decided less news, because news items tend to be pretty much go out of date, if you're going to be listening to this podcast 6 months down the road. So we want to have more intelligent, mind, what's the word here? Not mind altering, but, mind blown, mind expanding material. There you go.
Mind bending.
And none other than, our maestro over here, Brian Roemmele, will be a big part of it. Brian, how are you?
Doing wonderful, guys. It is such a pleasure to be back. It's great to hear your voices again. I feel like we're at a warm fireplace having a great conversation. I think what we're going to be doing moving forward for everybody is connecting dots from the past to the present and to the future. And it's centered around the coin, right? I mean, I think how we name this podcast, is a lot of different stories, but basically the coin represents, or money represents, so much. And I hope that we're going to start looking at what that really means. What do you think, folks?
Brian, what does it mean to you? We were talking a little bit about it, but what do you see money as? I mean, as far as where we are now, maybe a little bit of history as to what it was, but clearly right now we're sitting in the midst of a global shift in how people think about money, both in forms of its ability to store currency, to send value to each other, and then also new purposes for money that really weren't possible before, cryptocurrency and some of the blockchain applications. What's your macro view on things now?
Mike, great question. 2019 is going to be my macro time anyway. I'm going to be presenting sort of some of my grand theses for the first time publicly. But let's just look at the concept of money. Money is symbolic, right? It is a symbolic measure of only two things, fundamentally two things. It's either your time or your money, your time or your knowledge. So basically, when you look at what a coin represented, a coin was really the first time that we symbolically took something of really no value. See, a lot of people go down to shells and beads, but they actually did have some value to people. They had a functional value in their lives. They made necklaces out of them. So they became a trading unit. Let's call it a commodity. But when we forged together bronze had no intrinsic value beyond the fact that you could take a whole lot of these coins and maybe make a sword out of it or something. But let's just look at this, take my little theory here, that when we symbolically assigned our knowledge or our time to a thing called a coin or a shekel by the Sumerians, Sumerian ring coin was really the first symbolic unit of measure, we transformed humanity. We transformed everything we did. It liberated us, but it also inhibited us. It jailed us at the same time. So with everything in humanity, there's a possibility of liberation and there's a possibility of it being used against us. And I think what we're going to be doing as we move forward in these shows is sort of that theme weaved through everything is what does cryptocurrency really represent? Is it really new? Is the concept of cryptocurrency new? No. In fact, if you look at almost everything, there's an analogy in nature. We're really just duplicating the concepts that we see in nature. And one of my theses I've had for decades now, and I don't talk about it much, but I'll talk about it today, is money is a seed. And if you look at what the seed really represented in evolution is, let's look at the concept of a seed inside of a fruit. Let's say a tomato, which tomato is a fruit. We take a bite of a tomato and we're consuming it, right? And it just so happens that it goes into the perfect conditions for it to reproduce itself. When we eat a tomato, it's fortifying us, it's giving us energy, and it's allowing us to live and to survive. And then when we're done with it, we deposit it into a substrate, a substance that allows that seed, which we did not consume, maybe a few of them we chewed on, but most tomato seeds don't get consumed. And it went into a pile in the middle of the savannah. And maybe another animal, unfortunately, might have eaten some of it. And maybe some other bugs might have gotten to it. But some of those seeds will be drawn into the ground. And maybe that one time, maybe 10 times, but sooner or later, a tomato plant would pop up. And now that one seed generates 1,000, 10,000 tomatoes. So that's what money is. And when you look at it from today's perspective, we've overly made it complex. We've overly deified it, but it is a revolutionarily transformative way for us to multiply either our knowledge or our time. Now,
do you see it as just we have a 1,000,001 applications for it today, given how complicated the world is, how many different things people want to do with money, that the complexity of all the applications and systems and currencies are just a function of how much people want to do? And does it make sense? In other words, is there a natural alignment of the complexity of it all? I mean, we all just can't trade shekels anymore. Obviously, there needs to be digital trading, so it happens instantaneously across great distances. And then, the rise of blockchain really allows it to be decentralized or not controlled by one central power, which feels like that's the great economic shift that's happening. And we were talking earlier, but the rise of, not really the rise, but the change of, it's not necessarily power, but it's the threat of power change between the system and the decentralization. It's like the people versus the system is this archetypical historical clash that seems to go seesaw back and forth, right? As people gain power, they threaten the system, and then the system, pushes back. And the system has regulation at its fingertips, and it uses regulation. And we seem to be at this super interesting point where it all comes down to what's going to happen as far as regulation. U.S. really banking regulation is at the tip of the spear in determining which way are we going to go. And when the internet came around, I think the U.S. made a pretty intelligent move by just letting it flourish first and then regulating later. And it seems that that's going to be the pathway forward, but it does. I mean, in my vision, I'd be curious to hear what you guys think, but the pathway of decentralization pretty much at the end state seems to remove the necessity of large banks, or at least remove the essential power they have now. Maybe they exist, and I'm sure they would exist, but they would be greatly diminished in what they'd be able to do relative, or what we even need them to do relative to what people want to happen in the world. So I just can't see a great power like the U.S. banking system and the Central Reserve losing a tremendous amount of power without putting up a great fight. And it seems I don't know how that plays out.
Well, Brian mentioned shekels, right? I mean, Sumerian shekels, you're going back a couple of thousand years back, but banking itself is only 600 years old, right?
Absolutely.
And when you talk about, I think we've run out of all the more innovative ways of making money, and we've resorted down to making something simple, something more silly and complex. If you look at all the GDP of the entire world that produces a product or a service, it's about $75 trillion. If you look at all the debt size of the derivative market, it's 900 trillion. And derivative markets do not produce a product or a service.
Exactly.
I mean, you have to understand that part. You bring Elon Musk into the equation, and before I bring Elon Musk, Giovanni di Medici was one of the first guys who actually made the decentralized ledger when these Venetian and Milanese merchant bankers came on board. They had registered,
and then the Dutch, the Dutch and the insurance companies,
and they had all their ledgers worldwide, and there wasn't an internet to sort of bring them into update them, and they had to trust these decentralized ledgers, and every now and then they would sort of synchronize amongst themselves. And the reason I bring Elon Musk is 20 years from now, 40 years from now, you can still bring and think about money. But what happens to money when the very planet where it was defined is no more, and you are now extending and out to another interplanetary system, and you decide to live there? How does the United States dollar work over there? Gene Roddenberry's future did not have money.
Exactly. And it's fundamentally important to understand what Faisal just said, and it's brilliant, is that the Viennese and the Dutch and even the British East India Company, they all understood the idea of currency. Currency comes from the root word of current, meaning water current, meaning flow, the flow of money, cash flow. What does this all mean? It means that for this system to perpetuate itself, it has to flow, it has to move. And it got sort of locked up into this, I think, a dead end of derivatives of derivatives of derivatives of derivatives, to the point where you're not even trading time for money or knowledge for money. You're trading craftiness for money, to the point where if you read the book Flash Boys and things like that, where nanoseconds matter of you trying to get an edge. At some point, none of that's going to matter. Those things are going to fall apart. And I say currency because currents of water know no boundaries. Oceans don't know a boundary. Lakes and rivers really don't know a boundary unless somebody pollutes it on the other sides or dams it. But when they dam the water and it doesn't flow to its natural place, you create a temporary ecosystem. And ultimately, the forces of nature will destroy that temporary ecosystem. And we can look at many points in history. We can even look at what happened in Yosemite. In Yosemite, for example, they got rid of the wolves. And when they got rid of the wolves, something dramatically happened to the ecosystem in the forest. Because the wolves were gone, the deer had no natural predator, so they multiplied.
Humans killed off the wolves?
Humans killed off the wolves because they were dangerous. But here's what happened.
But the natural balance was upset, no?
Yeah, the law of unintended circumstances is when the man sticks their hand in thinking that they know nature or they know nature better. So we got rid of the wolves because they're dangerous, right? Got to get rid of those dangerous wolves. So the deer population overgrew. And because they overgrew, they started eating away at some of the trees that were fortifying the river basins for the currents of the water. And so the water started to erode even wider and wider. And the forest started to become a different ecosystem, a different environment. And, ecologists at the time were just beside themselves. They didn't understand what's going wrong. This whole thing, it's changing. This climate, this ecosystem is changing. What did we do? Nobody really understood it except the Native Americans. A Native American elder came and spoke and said, hold on, I heard that you were worried about the river basins. Yes. Do you know why that happened? He goes, oh, of course, you got rid of the wolves. And you know what everybody did? They left. They laugh because they don't listen with their real mind. What that elder said, and this is lost in a lot of historical accounts of this, and I urge anybody to go and research this because it's a real phenomenon that what took place in Yosemite.
Where would you point them? I'm just curious.
I got to look up the book. There's a book about
but it's a very famous case study. And they brought the wolves back.
Yeah. So let me come to the conclusion.
70 years later, right?
Yeah. So let me come to the conclusion of this. It's very interesting. Is that once the Native American elder explained what the wolf really meant to the entire balance of the system, they said, we've tried everything. Let's try it. So they reintroduced the wolves and they let them go to their natural balance. The wolves, they will take care of themselves. Most predators will only reach a certain level. They will never overpopulate, but the prey will overpopulate. You get rid of rattlesnakes, you'll have a whole lot of mice. There won't be too many rattlesnakes. I can go on and on in this. So when they reintroduced the wolves, something dramatically changed. All of a sudden, the trees that were being eaten, the berries and all the different things that were fortifying the river basins, they started growing back. The roots started growing stronger. The river started flowing correctly, and something else happened. The beavers, which were gone for almost 100 years from Yosemite, came back. Now, the beavers were also thought of as pests. Look at these guys. They're damming up our river. Get them out of there. They put logs here. They're messing things up. So when the beavers started damming the river and diverting its flow and creating pools of micro ecosystems, other species started to flourish. And now we're back 70 years later, like Faisal said, into closer to a balance of that particular ecosystem. So currency or currents need to flow unimpeded. This is the way of life. And so when you take this historic view and you overlay it on banking and governmental systems, you realize the folly involved. You realize that it's a temporary system. And then when you go in there and you take out the wolves, which need to be in the ecosystem, unfortunately, when you go out there and you say there ought to be a law, we need to take this thing and protect, all of a sudden you're now creating an unintended rippling effect through an entire economy. You are favoring one element in the economy over another. And, some people might say, Brian, that sounds sort of anarchic or free enterprise. It's not anarchy, and it may be laissez-faire capitalism.
No, and you know what I would say? I would say, in hindsight, the knee-jerk reaction is situational awareness,
Yes.
But the long term is, the Indians in this case, the American Indians, they had the institutional memory of what
wisdom.
Institutional memory, right? That's what it is.
Yes.
So they had the historical understanding of what the greater picture looks like zoomed out over, let's say, 100 years or 200 years. So that institution memory is what saved this thing. But in a very short sample of the snapshot, you have situational awareness, and you say, I think this is happening, and we should do this. We ought to do this. We ought to do this, and you screw things up. If you look at the Christianity and Islam, they actually forbid hoarding of money or hoarding of goods or grain or anything like that. It's a current system in the flow. When it's flowing, they say economies are good.
Yeah. See, when, and that's why it's so important to understand the root words and the history. When things flow, there's life. And we humans didn't choose to create the idea of this abstract thing called money or coins. We modeled nature. We created a seed, and we plant this seed we call money into fertile ground, we hope. And that fertile ground produces a tree that can produce more fruit. Now, some people call that a Ponzi scheme. Some people call that, a perpetual motion device. I urge those people to go and look into nature. Nature does not create unsustainable systems, not for long. The system will reevaluate itself through natural selections, if you will, and represent itself with a more fortified version. But you have to remember, the versions that came before it weren't just dropped out of nowhere. They're built on a pyramid. Let's call it natural wisdom. And at the top of that pyramid, it might be us because we're anti-entropy devices. Everything else falls prey to entropy pretty quickly. Humans constantly are trying to rearrange things from chaos into order. Entropy says that everything will go into chaos, and ultimately it will. Everything humans create will be a product of some form of entropy. But during our time and our stewardship, we're trying to create anti-chaos. Inside of that model, we must be able to create a seed. And that seed is the financial instrument called money. And the other part of that is called knowledge or wisdom. We are awash in data, and data is useless without the pyramid growth to the top of that point, what we call wisdom. There are interconnected dots that make these things happen. And we hope in these shows to become dot connectors, to try to connect past, present, and future, and to try to see the macro view. Bitcoin prices go up, go down, but where are they going to go long term? It should be really obvious at this point. Gold, silver, where is that going to go? Well, I encourage anybody listening to me to look up the Apollo Armor L5 satellites. These Apollo Armor objects are very close to Earth. As Faisal mentioned, Elon Musk is going to, or somebody, or maybe the Chinese, are going to take us there. And in these satellites are going to be 10, 20, 100 times more gold and platinum than we've ever discovered. Then what happens to the financial basis? Even though people feel that we're no longer on a gold standard or silver standard and precious metals don't matter, that's
a lot of inflation.
Wrong. Yeah, that's wrong. We actually do still need those things to transfer wealth forward. And the question is, if those things become commodity, which I believe they will in our lifetime, we're not going to say next 20 years at least, then what do we count on as being a precious item? The only thing that we're left with is the abstraction of mathematics, or whether that's quantum mathematics or current encrypted mathematics that we're using for blockchain. The bottom line is we still need to value, and we still need to transfer that value.
So are you drawing this conclusion that money was, we're in many ways, humans are not distinct from nature. We're a part of it. So yes. As we get more sophisticated, we're evolving from the monkey did chimp days, and we start, getting more complex with language, and we figure out some basic technologies like the fire and the wheel, and, building houses and clothing and everything else. And then eventually money comes around as this stored value, which makes sense, right? Because you can't just trade bluntly grain for clothing. There's some inefficiency there. So you need a stored value to be able to handle that inefficiency of trade. And it's really early days, really all about trade. So then, fast forward to today, money is used for many more things than just trading individually one-on-one with someone. We have mortgages, we have long-term payments and debts and loans and everything else.
Sure. So
money being, if you take it for truth that money or the stored value is inevitable, and you take it on board that humans eventually would have stumbled across electricity, the proliferation of going from electricity to communication with Morse code to all the way to cell phones and beaming communication. We figure out the internet, we all can connect with one. And then there's still that ability, you still really a need to store value. Do you take that and say, well, decentralization or cryptocurrency is actually just another step. It's another inevitable step.
Exactly.
In this somehow sequential pathway to, I don't know where the pathway goes, but it feels in hindsight it connects the dots.
Well, what's the digital equivalent of that little bag with gold nuggets that you can hide?
Exactly. That's
right?
Brilliant.
It's as simple as that, right? It's mathematics, right? And it also happens to be the universally understood language, right? So anytime we bring in other planets or other life forms, etc., mathematics would be the connector. That's what they keep telling us. I hope it is true. But right now, if I want my wealth, here's a very simple question. I want my wealth as per the standards that we can agree on today in my hands. What's wrong in that?
Exactly. And if you look at what we're all trying to do, every society on this planet, every individual, is that in some way we're trying to project our future generations, whether we have children or we mentor or we're just trying to give out our knowledge. So we're trying to project a better world. We're trying to project our wisdom into the future. And when we accumulate wealth, whatever wealth that is, we want it to be able to be transferable in our lifetime into something that will allow us to at least put a roof over our head, food on our table, have the good life, whatever that defines with you, right? Objectively, what a good life is subjective to that individual. So it's an objective, subjective. And when we look at the extremely wealthy in the world,
but also not subjective to manipulation. Exactly.
Because one of the ways that the system has sort of hijacked and maybe put too many wolves, or no, let's put it this way. Let me use a better analogy. Instead of putting wolves in there, they dropped in maybe elephants, maybe hyenas, things that were not originally part of the ecosystem gets dropped in.
That would be crazy. Dropping into Yosemite?
Yeah.
Hyenas?
Yeah, right. So, and now you start saying, I got power, because what I did is I have the special knowledge of hyenas, and I'm going to go in there and I'm going to dominate this system. So if you go back to my original thesis, there's only two things. It's your time or it's your knowledge. And we now live in a world, and this is why it's so transformative at this moment, because we have 60 years of the computer revolution, and now we have normalized knowledge. Now, let's not call it knowledge. Let's call it data and information into the hands of pretty much everybody on this planet. So at one point in time, you had to go either into a secret society, a wisdom school, a university, a college, or some this trade school to try to learn something that was, let's call it, information and knowledge. And it was not widely available. So those people who had special knowledge got more money, right? And those people who didn't have special knowledge, they had to trade their hard labor or their time for money. And when you look at the mathematics, let's look at your mathematics today. If the average person lives to 75 and they are working 8 hours a day, and you add up all those hours, how much money can you make if you're, say, 3 times the minimum wage? You're not going to get very far in that mathematics if you want to live what you think is a very wealthy life, right? You might live a good life. I'm not saying that that's a bad life. But if you look at the people who have been, quote unquote, successful, they're no longer trading their time for money, really. They're trading their knowledge for money. And that knowledge becomes leverage, and so does the money. And they use that leverage by finding the fertile soil to plant the seeds of money. I use these analogies because they're extremely simple to understand. You put the seed in the wrong soil, it will not generate a plant. But if there is sunlight, water, and fertile soil, you will have a tree. Just don't pull out the roots and the stalk too quickly.
But Brian, so you have your small potato patch farm. The government or the society in general says,
yes,
but if you keep those potatoes yourselves, bad boy, give them to us, we'll keep them. Yes, we can make mistakes.
We know better than you.
We know better than you. But you are not allowed to keep your own potatoes. You're not allowed to keep your own wealth. It is frowned upon today. The system, quote unquote, makes it look like you are
brilliant.
You're going against the norms of society, like you've got something wrong. Again, our institutional memory fails us over here,
Yeah, and that's why we're at such a critical point in time, because we now have the tools available where mathematics will transcend any border, any philosophy, any religion. And the only way one could try to regulate that is to try to look at the bad stuff that's being done with it.
Yeah, that's very true.
Right. So you look at the bad stuff and you say, see, there ought to be a law because look at who the bad people are using.
That's always the excuse, right? I mean, that's the de facto knee-jerk reaction. Just look at the smallest of the negative news and amplify it 100 times full. But again,
absolutely.
But the basic thing is, you should have the ability. You should have the ability to keep in a in some manner the wealth equivalent of your output. Simple.
Absolutely. I think it is a human right.
I think it's a fundamental right, right? It's a
Yeah,
fundamental
I think it is a fundamental right. And I think in our lifetime, unless something really bad happens, that's the only direction we can go in.
And
is that
bad
we
is
need to
gonna happen,
recognize
right?
it.
I mean, the government.
Ultimately it will.
The politicians, everyone else, they've known to make mistakes. The bureaucrats have made mistakes. The power brokers have made mistakes. The bankers, the financial community. Who suffers? The small potato patch farmer.
Exactly.
Do you think that's a real? I almost question whether that's even a reality. Is the idea that, say Faisal's working at McDonald's and you work 10 hours at $10 an hour and you make $100. So you have $100 you put in your bank account, assuming no taxes or transaction costs, right? You're putting that in your bank account. Now you have the equivalent of 10 hours of your energy at some output, call it McDonald's, stored in a repository. And now that's fixed. You could almost look at it as like energy in a box.
I wish it was,
but
inflation is taken away from every moment.
The ability that the institution can say, okay, this energy has a leak and it's leaking from the container. Sorry, my foot hit the container and 60% of your energy just leaked out.
Sorry about that. Your 10 hours is now only worth 5 hours. Now it's worth 3.
Or no, 2, right?
Or 1.
And by the way, we will still tax you on that. Or you know what? So how would you feel about that part? I mean,
that's what's going on.
And this is not being a leftist or anarchist or, being a libertarian.
Or a rightist.
Yeah, exactly, or a rightist.
This is humanity.
Well, all right. Well, let me give you another example. Say I have a hamburger that I'm selling at McDonald's, and I say I'm selling it for $4, and you say, well, that seems like a fair price. You pay $4, you eat your hamburger, you're happy. And then what if all of a sudden I charge $100 for it? You say that's outrage. That's not what it should cost. I'm never going to buy it here again. And you just would feel there's some injustice there, and the company's going to go out of business, etc. But then, what if you're selling that hamburger on an island where there's no food, and this is the only food? You would pay everything you have. You'd pay literally your entire life savings for that hamburger if it were to keep you alive.
See, when you put that condition, your assumptions are slightly incorrect. If that is the only hamburger on an island, the essence of money evaporates over there. Food is the important element over here. What can you trade for food? Well, I can trade 2 hours of labor for that food. Well, not good enough. I need 6 hours of labor. Okay, I can do 6 hours of labor, and so forth. Or I can give you grass for your cows, or what have you.
Or
blah, blah, blah. But
knowledge.
Knowledge, right? So institutional memory. There you go, right?
Yeah.
So institutional memory. I'll share some of the institutional memory. I mean, that's what the code talkers.
Hammurabi.
The code talkers of World War II did, right?
Oh yeah. There's a threshold, and Faisal makes a great point. There is a threshold where the
Navajo code talkers.
Navajo code talkers. Yeah. There's a threshold where the concept of abstract currency breaks down. And that's when your basic substances, food, shelter, clothing, protection of your innocence and young, that's when there's a threshold. Anything below that threshold, it becomes...
It happens in prisons, in not the modern day prison, but let's say in the 1700s, 1600s, 1800s. In prison, the value of money, I have a gold coin. It didn't matter. What mattered was how many cigarettes you could get. What mattered how much airtime you could get. Not airtime as in like minutes, but how many minutes in the sun you could get. What better broth you could get, and so forth. That is what mattered at that time. The essence of money evaporated, and all that was traded was against what could you do for me? Well, I'll scrub the floors for you. I'll bend some steel.
It was just pure trade.
Exactly.
Yeah, but that's time. That's giving your time for money, or time for value, if you will. And that's where humans are transitioning past that moment in time, because between artificial intelligence and robotics within our lifetime, the concept of manual labor is going to change dramatically. And that leaves a human with really only one thing, and that's knowledge and wisdom. And it's what makes us uniquely human. And if we don't understand this quickly enough, we're going to have the institutional memories that are only short term come around and say, oh boy, we need you to go back to, standing in front of a machine on the Ford, production line because we need to make you feel useful. Obviously, that doesn't make sense. But the transition between that mindset and the mindset that is going to come forward with the idea of cryptocurrency, the idea of commodity precious metals arriving, and the idea of artificial intelligence and the idea of robotics, the mindset that's going to come about is, what does a human really represent within society? These are things that I can explain, but they may not make much sense even at this moment with all of that background. But there is a way of it. There is a gravity. And the past is actually informing us on where we're going to be going in the future. And it's going to be centered around this abstraction that we call a coin or currency. And I think in these shows, we're going to explore this and maybe help give definition to the confusion that's taking place in life. We're going to be hitting a fairly bad economy in 2019.
Why? Yeah, I'm curious. Let me ask you about that. So I want to hear both your perspectives. So there's this kind of subconscious or unconscious feeling across society that we're headed towards a recession, right? We've been on a bull run for 10 years almost. And, we feel like, well, there's natural cyclical processes in the economy. We bull and we bear and we go up and down. And then we've been on a long run of going well, so it's got to turn down. And there's this myth that's just pervasive across society that we're just headed towards a recession and it's almost here. But the only thing that makes that true is that we believe it. Once everyone believes there's a recession, they sell everything. People start selling. The prices of things go down. People talk about things are not worth what they used to be worth. And then that myth, which really the myth of money is just a myth. It's just a common belief that we all have. That starts to become the reality. And I just question whether that's the right, or whether that's the message I want to push out in the world, which is we're headed towards a recession. Because the more people who believe that, it's like the more momentum it gains and the more of a reality it becomes. And if we believe truly that we're on this cyclical process, then maybe it's inevitable that we believe it and it actually happens. But it doesn't feel like we have to believe that.
No. So I think there are a few maybe things that you need to iron out. It is cyclical by nature, but what cannot be predicted with accuracy is when that cycle would actually take the turn for the worse. There are many indicators. An example we were talking pre-show was the yield curve, the U.S. yield curve, the bond yield curve. And whenever the yield curve inverts, the recession follows. It has and we've been tracking this thing for the last, 40, 45, 50 years. And whenever the yield curve has inverted, recession has happened. Not immediately, back and forth. But there are indicators. The problem right now is, when I said that there's funny money at play, that we are now taking money and doing things with it, making more and more complex decisions that whose effect, yes, makes money for the ultra rich, but then we don't know what to do with it. The U.S. had quantitative easing. Simple English, print more money. And we did it so much, and the interest rates went to zero, and people borrowed and they made money. Now when that collapse is going to occur, money is going to be taken away, the repercussions will be felt. There's no doubt about that. Every economist believes that. How it's the severity of it that the economists disagree.
So, Faisal, just to tighten that up, so you're saying that there had been some financial decisions made on interest rates and a Federal Reserve lending that make it inevitable, like we're in so much debt right now?
Well, after the thing, the United States did quantitative easing, which basically means they print more money. That means more money comes in, so banks in the United States can borrow the money at next to zero, because the interest rates in the United States were almost zero. I think 0.2% or 2.5%.
It was actually negative for a while.
And you're talking about 2008 timeframe after the recession?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So you could borrow money. Let's say you could borrow money from the Federal Reserve at 0.5, at 50 basis points. You take that money in dollars and you go invest it in Turkey, in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Saudi Arabia, in Iran. Well, not Iran. Bad example. Austria, etc. in projects. Why? Because money is cheap in Ghana, in Nigeria, and so forth. And you make money there. And everyone else is doing the same. They're borrowing money because it's very cheap to borrow money, and investments are going on. And when you're investing in Ghana for an airport, more cement needs to be made, more tractors need to be bought, and guess what? Exports are going to happen from the U.S., etc. At some point in time, everyone says, okay, the economy is doing really good. We'll stop the quantitative easing. We've got to take this money out of circulation. Taking the money out of circulation also is a tremendous process. And now the United States is actually offering a higher return on the money than you would get rather than investing in, let's say, Turkey. So you take your money out of Turkey. There's a possibility of a default in Turkey because they were not expecting this money to get out. That has repercussions. All the money going back has repercussions. All the money sitting in bank accounts just to earn interest has repercussions because it's not now being, as Brian said, the current is not flowing in the economy. It's now stagnated at certain places. So the repercussions are going to happen, no doubt about that. It's the severity of it that we don't know how severe it's going to be because we have introduced a digital heroin, so to speak, for the United States economy called quantitative easing. The EU has also gone. I forgot the number. It is a ridiculous number.
It's so large.
How do you take the money back? You actually don't take the money back. You have to park that money in specific banks and pay the banks not to release that money. And that number also is in billions of dollars what you have to pay. So we are looking at a very skewed condition here that we've never experienced before. We know everyone's going to get dirty when the truck goes by and the pool of the muddy waters is going to hit you. We just don't know how bad. It's a guaranteed almost.
And that's the thing about memory and about understanding cycles. Everything has a cycle. There's nothing that doesn't have a cycle in this universe. Nothing. So if you live long enough and you're observant, you realize there are cycles. And the people who tend to succeed have this longer term memory, and they understand this whole thing's going to crash, but I have a parachute. I'm going to jump just before the thing crashes, and on the other side, I'll help pick up the pieces and coordinate it. We can go way back in time, all the way up into the most recent bubble in the 2008 markets. People are going to do exceedingly well, but at the end of the day, there's going to be a whole lot of people, like Faisal said, the small potato farmer. They're going to be sitting there looking at it and say, oh boy, I don't think there's ever going to be a good day again. It's all over. It's all ended. The thing about it is all of this stuff has been artificially created to begin with. The idea of money is an abstraction. It's an invention of humans. It has no bounds to reality. We're just using analogies that we've seen in nature, the concept of the seed, and it's unique, thesis I have.
Help me with this. So if I'm a listener, and even me included, if I'm thinking, well, I'm a bit skeptical that the market has to go into a recession in the next year. It could just rise again for another year. But the pressure, the argument to say that it would go into a recession is that the cost to get money, the interest rate really initially tied by the Federal Reserve, and the rate at which we print money, those seem to be the two levers that the government controls, or the Federal Reserve has influence over. Those are pointed now in a direction where the interest rate is at a point, and the influx of new currency into the economy is at a point that would say it's not sustainable. That what we've done previously with low interest rates and inflation is not sustainable, and so there needs to be some kind of backlash to that. Am I summarizing that correctly?
Mike, there's something even more. There's a cycle, and then there's something else that's sort of unusual. 2019 is going to be presenting 2020. 2020 is an election year in the United States. It's going to be the most tumultuous year in the United States in history. You will never experience in our lifetime a time of more diverse, let's say even crazy type of things are going to happen. 2019 is going to set the stage for that. The people who are believing one theory of the world versus the people that believe another theory of the world are going to do a lot to try to encourage a certain thesis that they believe in by manipulating the money, by moving the money in directions that are not necessarily encouraging an outcome in 2020 that some people might have expected. And you can speculate on all this, but I just invite people to take a couple of steps, maybe 10 steps back from the left versus right, Democrat versus Republican, liberal versus conservative versus communist versus capitalist, all this stuff. And just take a step back and say, you know, there are people that control the dam up ahead. And if they decide to cut that dam loose by accident or on purpose on by accident, and that water runs down to the village, there's going to be a catastrophe. And that catastrophe is going to require a different mindset for the recovery. That recovery is going to begin in 2020 or may still be existing in 2020, the catastrophe. So there's a couple of confluences that are going to cause this to happen. And again, I'm not here to talk politics. I'm not here to talk about any of that. At the end of the day, all of that shit is irrelevant. If you take a 100-year view of it, you'll laugh at it. You look at it from day to day, turning on CNN or MSNBC or Fox, you're going to be down in the trenches saying, he said that, she said that, they're doing this, he's that, they're that. Or you can take a few steps back and say, hold on. It certainly seems that certain groups of individuals always seem to prosper, no matter what the crises are, no matter how bad it looks. What is their thinking? What is the system that they use? What is their knowledge?
The macro view.
Exactly. So if we can assist people in understanding the macro view without necessarily giving investment advice or talking politics or even philosophy in that matter, just being an empiricist, just looking at things empirically, meaning I'm observing things, I'm seeing cause and effect, and then I go back in time, not trying to use any of our own, congruencies that we've learned or biases, but just trying to look at it objectively and saying, has this ever happened before? Is this really new? Is this so different this time? It will turn out, I promise you, never to be different this time. Even the worst case scenario, the entire breakdown of the culture, with the Roman Empire to study, or the Greek Empire, Ottoman Empire. We can go, Alexandrian Empire. We can go the dynasties in China. You study this history. You don't need to be a historian. You can just study it, casually. You realize that what looked like the world ended, was ending. Yeah, there were some dark ages. With the decline of the Roman Empire, there was
like the show must go on.
But humans,
things continue.
Humans ultimately are anti-entropy, and we will survive. But what's coming up ahead is inevitable, and we could change it. But I'm just saying, perhaps the people who are controlling the dams of the flow of the currents, they may not want this.
That's the struggle, right? Is between the consolidation of power and then the individuals. I mean, that's kind of what the whole bipartisan view is in politics, not just in America, but throughout other countries. Is like, is that hierarchy structure, is that too rigid? Do we want to, should we take away that power, which would be what the liberals would say about the federal government? Or as a conservative, do you want it'd be an argument to say, does the conservative party want less power in government, more control for the people, more control for the individual, more individual rights, and put more freedom? Use the word freedom as a means to say there's more power in the individual. Or, on the more democratic side, you say the power is in the centralization of the hierarchy. There's Medicare for all, there's free education, there's free healthcare, there's free this, it's regulated, we tax highly. So there's that there's that constant push and pull where you both need a central structure, but you also need it to not be insanely powerful. And going back to payments, I feel like it's just a fun time right now because cryptocurrency really pushes this battle, right, to put a negative spin on it, but it's not a negative thing. It's just a neutral thing. This is a tool for individuals, for people to rally behind, right? I mean, when I send you money on Bitcoin and we create a app that uses Bitcoin, it's outside of the rails of the banking system. Well, that just means the government they can't get at it, right? You can look at the blockchain and maybe try to regulate it that way. But the banking system is easily regulated because you can walk in the front door with police and you can say, show me your records, and they have to do it. But there's like a lack of ability in some sense to fully regulate a lot of the things that have been historically regulated in the banking system. So I hope it changes for the better, and for the better, just meaning, hey, people could do whatever they want. And then there's some acute regulation to stop people from doing things that we deem inappropriate by society and illegal. And those things are still going to happen, but it's a matter of like, where's the trade-off there? Where do you enforce that?
I'm hearing what you're saying, and it's great because I think we've come to the end of the show, but just to take it for next week, wealth storage, whether we do it by regulation, whether we do it out of protest, etc., how does that affect inequality that exists right now in society? I think that is the most important question. How can regulation change that? How can cryptocurrencies or blockchain change that? How will society change that? Because until and unless we change the inequality that has been building up since shortly after the mid-50s and 60s in the United States, that has had its tentacles reach out and go to other countries, and where inequality is building over there as well. Case in point was the derivatives market that I talked about. How do we reverse that? Because until we don't reverse that, this conversation, this inequality will exist. My potatoes will always belong to someone else. So till next time.
Till next time. Guys, it's been an awesome show. First show of season 4 back 2019. Look forward to many more.
Very excited over what 2019 will bring us, and it's great to be with you guys again.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Mike.
All right.
Till next time, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The views and opinions expressed on any program are those of the hosts, co-hosts, and guests appearing on the show and do not necessarily reflect the view of the owners and producers of the show. Paid advertisements in form of audio announcements may appear throughout the show, including this one. Advertising can also include print and other digital formats. The owners and producers of Around the Coin do not endorse or evaluate the advertised product, service, or company, nor any of the claims made by the advertisement. All programs are subject to a one-time charge for professional editing fees, for which the interviewing guest or guests may have contributed towards. The owners, producers, hosts, co-hosts, and guests on the show are not financial advisors. Any investment advice or opinion cited during the show is for information purposes only. None of the content is intended to be investment advice. Seek a duly licensed professional for investment advice. If you believe there's been any violation of your copyright, trademark, service mark, or any other type of intellectual property, please inform us in writing by sending an email to legal@aroundthecoin.com.